What would you think if I told you 6 people in one small county of North Carolina all died the exact same way? Sudden stomach pain, violent vomiting, days of agony, then death. Between 1969 and 1978, these tragedies seemed random. Tragic accidents, heart failure, maybe a stomach virus. Nothing unusual in rural Cumberland County, but here's the chilling part. Each victim had one thing in common. A soft-spoken grandmother named Velma Barfield. She was there every time, praying at the bedside, offering comfort, whispering scripture. To her neighbors, she was kindness itself. A church volunteer, a caregiver, a woman of faith. No one, absolutely no one, suspected her. Until 1978, at a Pentecostal revival, a 56-year-old man named Stuart Taylor suddenly collapsed. His death was almost brushed aside as another tragic twist of fate. But this time, his family demanded an autopsy, and what doctors found tore the mask off Velma's carefully built life. She had been quietly, methodically, using rat poison, turning trust into a weapon, and caregiving into a cover for murder. Velma Barfield would go down in history as one of America's most cunning killers, and later as the very first woman executed by lethal injection in the United States. But to understand how a grandmother became a murderer, we have to go back to where her story began. She was born Margie Velma Bullard, October 29, 1932, in Eastover, South Carolina, the second of 9 children, raised just outside Fayetteville, in a Pentecostal household where life was simple, strict, and built on hard work. The Bullards worked a small tobacco and cotton farm. No electricity, no running water. When nature called, the woods behind the house had to do. Poverty was the reality, but it wasn't shameful. Everyone around them lived the same way. Faith and family were everything. Daily prayers, regular church services, moral rules that left no room for rebellion. Despite the hardships, Velma stood out. In school, she was bright, kind, and quick to help struggling classmates. She earned good grades and had a knack for reading and writing. Teachers saw real potential in her, and then came basketball. At Parkton Public, Velma discovered she had quick reflexes and a surprising sense for strategy. She wasn't built like an athlete, but she was clever and competitive. The court gave her freedom, a brief escape from chores, from responsibility, from the grind of farm life. But that freedom didn't last. When her mother gave birth to twins, Velma, as the eldest daughter, was pulled back into duty. Housework, cooking, babysitting. Her days on the team were over. It crushed her. That's when she met Thomas Burke. He wasn't the best-looking boy around. Big ears, sharp features, but he was gentle, funny, and he treated Velma with respect. For a girl used to strict rules and a harsh father, Thomas was a glimpse of something better. Dating was forbidden at home. They stole moments between classes, whispered at church gatherings. Her father thought 16 was still too young for serious courtship, but by then, Velma and Thomas were in too deep. At 17, desperate to escape the suffocating rules of her household, Velma eloped. The couple married in 1949 in a simple ceremony before a justice of the peace. They moved into a small family house in Parkton. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. A chance at independence, a chance at happiness. What happened next would change that forever. And that's where we'll pick up the story of Velma Barfield, the grandmother who killed, the death row granny who shocked America. For the first time in her life, Velma had something she'd only dreamed of, her own home. A place she could run, her own decisions to make, and a future she could shape with Thomas by her side. And in those early years, it really did look like a happy ending. They dreamed of building the kind of family they'd both longed for as children. Laughter filled their little house. There was hope, stability, love. But all of that started to unravel in 1965, with a single accident. Thomas was driving home from his shift at the textile mill when his car skidded off a rain-soaked country road. The crash left him with a concussion and injuries he would never fully recover from. At first, things didn't seem too bad. He was back on his feet within weeks, back to work, determined to provide. But the pain never went away. The headaches weren't just headaches, they were brutal, blinding. Sometimes so bad he couldn't even move. Eventually, the mill let him go. Too many missed days, too much time off, and with the job went the family's stability. Like so many men of his generation, Thomas turned to alcohol. What started as a beer to dull the pain became a daily need, and as the drinking grew, so did the distance between him and Velma. Now remember, Velma had been raised Pentecostal. In her world, alcohol wasn't just a bad habit, it was a sin. And watching her husband slip further and further into the bottle was more than she could bear. She fought back in every way she could. She searched the house for hidden bottles, poured liquor down the drain, even asked the kids to help keep watch. But every battle only fueled more resentment. The man who had once been her gentle, funny Thomas was now angry, humiliated, and drowning in bitterness. Velma, meanwhile, felt abandoned, trapped, terrified for her family's future. Things reached a breaking point when Velma made a choice Thomas would never forgive. Without asking, she had him committed to Dorothea Dix Hospital in Raleigh for alcoholism treatment. Yes, the program worked. Thomas came home sober, but it destroyed whatever trust was left in their marriage. He came back resentful, cold, and convinced Velma had betrayed him. And during his time away, Velma had found her own escape. To cope with the stress, she'd begun leaning on prescription drugs. Valium at first, then more medications as her tolerance grew. The mill work was hard, raising kids alone was harder, and soon she was juggling her own quiet dependency. When Thomas finally returned, the marriage was no longer a marriage. Their home had become a cold war, constant arguments over money, the children, his inability to hold steady work. The love that had once carried them was gone. Then came the night of April 4th, 1969. Thomas had been drinking, enough to be sluggish, but not enough to pass out. Velma told him she had errands to run. Oddly, she took both children with her, heading out after dark, something she almost never did. When they came back, the house was on fire. Flames had already consumed nearly everything. Neighbors watched as the Parkton Volunteer Fire Department fought to contain the blaze, but it was too late. Inside, they found Thomas. His body was discovered in the bedroom where the fire seemed to start. The coroner ruled it smoke inhalation. Thankfully, he died before the flames reached him. The sheriff's deputies investigated, but fire forensics in rural North Carolina back then were basic at best. The conclusion? Thomas had fallen asleep smoking a cigarette. A tragic accident, nothing more. Velma's grief looked real. Too real. Witnesses said she broke down at the scene, screaming, trying to rush into the burning house until neighbors held her back. Her tears, her devastation, it was convincing enough to silence any doubts. The community rallied around her. At Thomas's funeral at Parkton Baptist Church, it seemed the entire town came to mourn, comfort, and support the young widow and her children. But behind those tears, what really happened that night? Was it truly an accident, or the first spark of something much darker? Stay with us as we uncover the chilling truth about Velma Barfield. Velma played the grieving widow so convincingly, it was almost impossible to question her. She accepted condolences with quiet dignity, spoke tenderly about Thomas's battles with pain and alcohol, and thanked her neighbors for standing by her during her darkest hour. But there were cracks in the story, subtle ones. Some neighbors remembered how just days before the fire, Velma had quietly moved out certain items, family photos, jewelry, important papers. She said they were being cleaned or repaired. Maybe that was true, but the timing, unsettling. And then there was that strange night itself. Velma, who almost never left home after dark, suddenly decided to take both children out for vague errands, leaving Thomas drunk and alone. The convenience of it all didn't sit right with some. 3 months later, the suspicion deepened. The charred remains of the Burke home somehow reignited, sparking a second fire. That blaze drew the attention of insurance investigators, and it led to a substantial payout for Velma. Add that to Thomas's modest life insurance policy and the generous donations from their church community, and Velma suddenly had more financial security than she had ever known. For a woman who had been scraping by, widowhood had brought comfort and profit. What no one realized yet was that the community had just witnessed the birth of something terrifying. Velma had discovered that death, when staged carefully, could solve her problems, win her sympathy, and even provide financial reward. And she liked it. The sweet-faced, Bible-reading grandmother had tasted blood, and soon she would crave more. The months after Thomas's death showed a new side of Velma. Outwardly, she remained the heartbroken widow devoted to her children. But behind the scenes, she began working her way into the life of Jennings Barfield, a well-off widower with property, steady income, and a respected place in the community. Jennings was 43, solid, trustworthy, the kind of man everyone admired. Velma pursued him with determination. She appeared at church functions she knew he'd attend, dropped by his farm with food or helpful offers, and slowly made herself indispensable. Jennings saw her as devoted, capable, and faithful. She was tidy, cooked well, kept house with care, and her religious image matched his values. To him, Velma seemed like the perfect partner. By August 1970, barely 16 months after Thomas's death, they married. The ceremony was modest but respectable, held at Jennings's church, with their children as witnesses. To the community, it seemed like a practical, even heartwarming union. On the surface, their marriage looked solid. Velma ran Jennings' household with precision and supported his business affairs. She even helped with his books and correspondence. But underneath, dangerous habits and darker patterns were taking shape. Velma's drug use, which had started back when she was overwhelmed caring for Thomas, was spiraling. Valium for sleep, Sinequan for anxiety, Tylenol with codeine for pain, antidepressants, pills prescribed by different doctors in neighboring counties, so no one would notice the growing dependence. The costs were enormous, and when Jennings began questioning the strange expenses, Velma always had an answer. Medical bills, emergencies for the children, unexpected needs. At first, her excuses worked, but as her appetite for drugs grew, so did her theft. Velma began forging checks. Small amounts at first, spread across multiple accounts, always just under the limit that would trigger bank scrutiny. She practiced Jennings' signature until it was flawless, and when confronted, she'd break down in tears, turning guilt into sympathy before Jennings could press further. For a while, it worked. Jennings was trusting, maybe too trusting, but in early 1971, his longtime banker, Harold Mitchell, started noticing patterns, unusual withdrawals. Spending that didn't match Jennings' careful habits. Something wasn't right, and Harold's suspicions would soon expose Velma's carefully hidden schemes. Velma Barfield's mask of the perfect wife was beginning to slip, and what came next would shock everyone who thought they knew her. What would you do if the person sleeping beside you wasn't just lying but planning your death? That was the nightmare Jennings Barfield never saw coming. At first, the warning signs were financial. His banker, Harold Mitchell, started noticing strange withdrawals and suspicious checks. Quietly, he asked Jennings about them, and the truth came out. Velma, the devoted wife everyone admired, had been forging checks, siphoning money, and covering it all with crocodile tears. When Jennings finally confronted her, it was explosive. He wasn't Thomas, her weak and broken first husband. Jennings was sharp, strong-willed, and furious. He demanded answers, no more excuses. He even threatened to involve the police and told Velma he was talking to a lawyer about divorce. For Velma, that wasn't just a fight, it was a death sentence. Divorce meant exposure, prosecution, humiliation, and no inheritance. But she'd already learned from Thomas's accidental death that permanent solutions could be cleaner. On March 22, 1971, Jennings sat down to an ordinary dinner. Hours later, agony ripped through his stomach. Cramping, nausea, violent vomiting, then crushing chest pain. At first he thought it was food poisoning or muscle strain, but the pain only grew worse. Velma, ever the doting wife, called the doctor and rushed him to the hospital. To everyone watching, she was a model of care and panic. But behind that mask, she already knew what was happening. Dr. Patterson, Jennings' physician, was baffled. Blood tests showed signs of infection, but no clear cause. As the night dragged on, Jennings' condition spiraled. His chest pain became unbearable. His blood pressure collapsed, and at 3:17 a.m., Jennings Barfield was gone. Officially, the cause was listed as acute heart failure, likely triggered by a stomach infection. Velma's performance of grief was flawless. She sobbed so hard the hospital had to sedate her. Friends and family carried her through the funeral, whispering about the tragedy of a woman who had lost 2 husbands in less than 2 years. But what most people missed was this. Jennings had recently taken out new life insurance, planning to expand his farm. Those policies, combined with his estate, left Velma far richer than she had ever been. And this time, there was no fire to explain, no messy cover story, The poison she'd used, arsenic, mimicked natural illness perfectly. A tragic death with symptoms doctors could easily mistake for infection and heart failure. Velma had leveled up. She wasn't just an opportunist anymore. She was a predator, learning to time her strikes and eliminate threats before they could destroy her. After Jennings' funeral, she wasted no time. Within weeks, she collected the payouts, sold off property, and bought a new home near her parents in Fayetteville. To outsiders, it looked like a grieving widow seeking comfort from family. But moving closer to her parents wasn't about love. It was strategy. Her father, Murphy, was already dying of lung cancer. His end would come naturally. But her mother, Lillian, was a different story. At 74, she had a modest pension, carefully saved funds, and growing dependence on Velma for daily tasks. That dependency gave Velma something priceless: access. She helped with bills, balanced the checkbook, and handled banking paperwork. Lillian trusted her completely. What she didn't know was that Velma was studying her signature, memorizing account numbers and quietly dipping into her funds. At first, it was small amounts, $20, maybe $30, easy to pass off as routine expenses. But as Velma's drug habit spiraled, so did her theft. She needed more pills, more money, more lies to keep it all going, and once again, her mother's trust became her weapon. Velma Barfield, the Bible-quoting grandmother, had perfected her method. Murder and manipulation weren't just tools. They were her way of life, and she was only getting started. How far would you go if even your own mother stood in the way of your secrets? By the summer of 1974, Velma's schemes were getting bolder. She wasn't just dipping into her mother's bank account anymore. She was stealing hundreds of dollars every month. And when she discovered that Lillian had insurance policies and savings bonds tucked away, the temptation was unbearable. Bigger money was right there within reach, but cashing them in would raise questions Velma couldn't talk her way out of. That's when Lillian's health began to take a terrifying turn. The symptoms came out of nowhere. Stomach cramps, nausea, diarrhea that lingered for days, then vanished just as suddenly. And during every episode there was Velma, hovering at her mother's side, spooning soup, offering tea, playing the role of the concerned daughter. Dr. William Stevenson, who'd been Lillian's physician for over 20 years, was baffled. Blood work showed nothing unusual. The symptoms looked like food poisoning, maybe a stomach bug, but no one else in the family was ever sick. Only Lillian. What the doctor didn't know, this wasn't illness. It was experimentation. Velma was testing her poison, adjusting doses, studying how long the effects would last, how sick her mother could get without dying. Every attack wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Each episode left Lillian weaker, more dependent, and more grateful for Velma's care. And the more vulnerable she felt, the easier it was for Velma to manage her finances and keep stealing. But Velma wasn't focused only on her mother. That same summer, she started dating a widower named Robert Mackenzie. To the outside world, Robert was drawn to her reputation as a loving daughter and faithful Christian woman. He started talking about marriage, about a future together. But by August, Robert was dead. A late-night crash on a lonely country road. No rain, no ice, no mechanical failure. Just a careful driver who somehow lost control and slammed into a tree. Toxicology tests weren't common back then, so no one asked deeper questions. To everyone else, it was a freak accident. For Velma, it was convenient. Robert had been getting too close, asking questions about her finances, about her family. Questions Velma couldn't afford to answer. By Christmas, Velma had another problem. Banks and insurance companies were getting ready for their year-end audits. If anyone looked too closely at her mother's accounts, the missing money and forged signatures would be impossible to explain. Velma needed to act. On December 28th, during what should have been a joyful holiday gathering, Lillian was hit with the worst episode yet. This time the pain didn't fade. It was constant, crippling. The vomiting was relentless. She became dehydrated, delirious. Velma, as always, was the picture of devotion, rushing her mother to the hospital, holding her hand, telling everyone she was doing everything possible. Dr. Stevenson was called in again. But once more, the test results offered no answers. The hospital staff tried fluids, medications, anything to keep her stable. Nothing worked. On December 30th, 1974, at 11:43 p.m., Lillian Bullard died. The death certificate listed complications from acute gastroenteritis. Velma's performance as the grieving daughter was flawless. She wept at the bedside. She needed sedation to sleep. The funeral drew the entire community, neighbors praising Lillian as a faithful Christian woman who had raised 9 children and lived a life of service. But behind the tears, Velma had pulled off her cleanest crime yet. Her mother's death wiped away the evidence of stolen funds, forged checks, and secret loans. Estate proceedings now gave Velma legal access to accounts she had already drained. And most chilling of all, she knew she could kill with absolute confidence. Doctors hadn't suspected a thing. Family hadn't questioned her. Law enforcement hadn't even looked twice. Velma had crossed a line that most killers never dare to approach. She had murdered her own mother. If she could do that, who was safe? By 1975, Velma's crimes were bigger, bolder, and so was her confidence. She believed she was untouchable. And that arrogance would eventually set the stage for her downfall. What happens when someone realizes that murder is easier to get away with than theft? For Velma Barfield, that chilling realization would turn her from a small-time scammer into something far darker. At first, her crimes weren't violent at all. She was a master of bad checks, careful with amounts, clever with timing. For years, she fooled banks, neighbors, and businesses. But then greed got the better of her. Velma grew reckless, and finally, she was caught. 7 counts of check fraud, serious felonies in North Carolina. This time, she wasn't just facing a slap on the wrist. She was staring at real prison time. The trial laid bare a pattern of lies and financial betrayal stretching across counties. From shopkeepers to family friends, anyone who trusted Velma ended up paying the price. The judge wasn't impressed by her poor widow act. He gave her 6 months in prison, a shocking sentence for a woman many still saw as struggling to survive. But here's the thing, prison wasn't the end of Velma's story. It was just the beginning. Instead of reform, she got an education. Surrounded by women who had made careers out of scams, she learned new tricks, sharper forgeries, identity theft, manipulation strategies. And worse, it inflated her ego. She had already poisoned 3 people and never raised suspicion. Even when she was caught stealing, she only got a few months. So what did she learn? Not that crime doesn't pay, but that murder was safer than fraud. After all, dead victims can't testify. Released after serving only 3 months, Velma came out smarter, colder, and with a new idea: target the elderly. During her time inside, she'd heard fellow inmates brag about scamming seniors. Easy money, no questions asked. Now she saw how perfectly her caregiving image could cover something far more sinister. Her next job seemed heaven-sent. In 1976, Velma was hired as a home health aide for Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, a wealthy elderly couple in Lumberton. Montgomery was 94, Dolly 84. They were frail, isolated, and desperate for care. And Velma? She looked like the answer to their prayers. She charmed them with church references and her talk of Christian devotion. Even asked for Sundays and Wednesday nights off for services. A perfect built-in alibi. The Edwards family felt lucky to have her. They handed her the keys to their home, their cars, even their bank accounts. It didn't take long for Velma to strike. She memorized their signatures, studied their finances, and began siphoning money with forged checks. Every theft carefully disguised as household expenses. Montgomery was too old and confused to notice, and Dolly had never handled the money. To them, Velma was a blessing. In reality, she was bleeding them dry. Then came January 29th, 1977. Montgomery Edwards passed away. 94 years old, frail, failing health. Nothing about his death seemed suspicious. The family praised Velma for her tireless care and begged her to stay on and help Dolly adjust. But just weeks later, Dolly started showing terrifying symptoms. Out of nowhere, she developed violent stomach cramps, nausea, and diarrhea. It hit fast, and it hit hard. And who was there by her side the entire time? Velma. Offering homemade broths and teas, whispering prayers, never leaving her alone. To everyone watching, she looked like the most devoted caregiver imaginable. But as Dolly's condition spiraled, questions should have been asked. Gastroenteritis? Maybe, but the speed and brutality of it, something wasn't right. On March 1st, 1977, Dolly Edwards died, Velma clutching her hand, playing the role of grieving companion. To the family, Velma was still a saint. They had no idea she'd just wiped out 2 lives and stolen their fortune. And the most chilling part? Velma wasn't done. What if the person holding your hand at the hospital, whispering prayers over you, was the very one who poisoned you? That was the chilling truth about Velma Barfield. At Dolly Edwards' funeral, her family stood up and praised Velma, spoke about how blessed they'd been to have such a kind, Christian woman by their side in those final months. They had no idea the real reason Dolly was gone. Dolly had started asking questions. Money missing, strange transactions, and Velma, she couldn't afford to let her secret slip. So she did what she'd done before, the permanent solution: poison. After Dolly's death, Velma didn't miss a step. She moved on quickly to another couple who needed help, John Henry Lee, 80, and his wife, Record, who was recovering from a broken leg. The Lees had heard glowing reviews about Velma, thanks to the Edwards family. A trustworthy Christian caregiver, they said, so when Record's injury made outside help unavoidable, they thought they were lucky to find Velma. John Henry was a proud man, a retired farmer who had worked the land, saved his money, and provided a comfortable life for his wife. He didn't even like the idea of bringing in a nurse, but age and Record's broken leg left him little choice, and Velma made herself indispensable. She handled his medications, cooking, cleaning, even bills and correspondence. She looked like a blessing, but behind the scenes she was doing what she always did, studying their finances. John Henry wasn't as easy as Montgomery Edwards. He was sharper, more hands-on with money. But Velma was patient. She forged small checks here and there, careful enough to make them look like routine expenses. Still, John Henry was beginning to notice. He started asking questions, and just like Dolly, he had unknowingly signed his death warrant. On June 4th, 1977, the nightmare began again. John Henry was suddenly struck with stabbing stomach pain, violent vomiting, and crushing chest cramps. A man who had been relatively healthy for his age was suddenly writhing in agony. And Velma? Right there by his side, the perfect nurse, calling the doctor, preparing her so-called healing teas and broths, acting the role of angel, while quietly finishing her plan. Dr. Marcus Webb, the family doctor, examined John Henry both at home and later in the hospital. On the surface, the symptoms looked like severe gastroenteritis, maybe food poisoning, maybe a virus. Except for one thing. Record Lee had eaten all the same meals. She was fine. Despite IV fluids, anti-nausea drugs, and constant monitoring, John Henry declined fast. Within 48 hours, he was gone. The death certificate read, complications from acute gastroenteritis. Tragic, but believable, especially for an 80-year-old man. Record was devastated. Her husband, taken just as she was beginning to recover from her injury. She leaned on Velma for support. And Velma, the wolf in disguise, comforted her, arranged the funeral, played the part of the grieving friend. Once again, no one suspected her. Once again, Velma had silenced someone who was starting to catch on. By now, the pattern was clear, but only if you looked closely. And in rural North Carolina in the 1970s, nobody could imagine a sweet church-going grandmother poisoning elderly patients. Each death was written off as just another sad loss in old age. The truth? Velma had perfected her method. The right dose of arsenic at just the right time. Enough to mimic natural illness. Enough to kill but never raise suspicion. She was operating in plain sight. Untouchable. But later in 1977, things changed. Velma crossed paths with Stuart Taylor. And this time, her target was very different. Stuart wasn't frail. He wasn't senile. He was 56, strong and sharp-minded. A hard-working tobacco farmer. Widowed after 30 years of marriage. He didn't have much money, but he had a good reputation and a simple, steady life. Velma met him through the Edwards family. They told Stuart she was dependable, godly, trustworthy. He saw her as stable, devoted, everything he'd been missing since his wife's death. What happened next would set Velma on the path to her ultimate downfall. What happens when a killer finally falls in love? For Velma Barfield, that question had a terrifying answer. On the surface, her relationship with Stuart Taylor looked like something out of a small-town romance. Velma cooked like a pro, kept a spotless house, and carried herself with the kind of values Stuart respected in a partner. After years of loss, this 56-year-old tobacco farmer thought he'd finally found comfort again. But here's the twist. Stewart wasn't like Velma's past victims. He wasn't rich enough to be worth killing for money. He wasn't frail or confused enough to be easily manipulated. For Velma, the relationship served a different purpose: stability, companionship, and most importantly, a mask of normalcy to hide the trail of suspicious deaths she'd left behind. They slipped into an easy routine. Stewart got home-cooked meals and company during lonely evenings. Velma got respectability in a tight-knit community. From the outside, it looked perfect. But behind that domestic calm, Velma was fighting demons. Her drug addiction hadn't gone away. Years of pill abuse meant her body needed bigger and bigger doses just to function. And that habit cost money, more money than her paycheck could ever cover. So, like before, she turned back to fraud. This time, Stewart's bank accounts became her playground. She studied his handwriting until she could forge it flawlessly, memorized his account numbers, and started writing small checks that blended right in with his normal expenses. For months, she got away with it. Stewart trusted her, rarely checking his bank statements, and when he did, Velma had excuses ready: household costs, little business expenses. She even used tears and emotional outbursts to shut down his suspicions. But in January 1978, her scheme started to crack. Harold Patterson, Stewart's longtime banker and friend, noticed something odd during a routine review. Stewart had always been conservative with money, but now checks were flying out of his account. At the feed store one day, Patterson casually asked if Stewart was making big purchases. Stewart was baffled. He hadn't spent a dime on those transactions. That conversation changed everything. By January 31st, Stewart had gathered the evidence, with Patterson's help, and confronted Velma. The argument was unlike anything they'd had before. Stewart demanded answers, demanded the truth. When Velma dodged, he pressed harder, and finally snapped. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shook her, and shouted that she'd betrayed him. For Stewart, it was an outburst of anger. For Velma, it was something else, a threat. And Velma had only one way of dealing with threats. That same night, despite the fight, the couple attended a Pentecostal revival at the Cumberland County Civic Center. Preacher Rex Humbard was leading the service, and Stewart agreed to go, hoping maybe the evening could help them mend things. They walked in dressed in their Sunday best. To everyone else, they looked like just another devoted couple. But as the service began, Stewart suddenly fell ill. A wave of nausea hit him, sharp and fast. At first he brushed it off, chalking it up to nerves from their earlier argument. But within minutes the pain grew unbearable. He stumbled out to the restroom. Velma followed right behind, playing the role of caring partner. People later remembered her devotion that night, how she stayed by his side, offering to take him home. She did exactly that. The drive was torture for Stewart. Cramps, vomiting, chest pain. And over the next 3 days, his suffering only grew worse. Violent stomach pain, relentless vomiting, difficulty breathing. His body was shutting down. Velma nursed him around the clock, offering her teas, her broths, her tender reassurances. She held his hand, wiped his forehead, and told anyone who asked that she was doing everything possible to comfort him. But behind that mask of compassion, she was the one who had poisoned him. What if the person sitting faithfully at your hospital bedside was the very reason you were dying? That's exactly what happened in 1978, when Stewart Taylor's sudden illness exposed one of North Carolina's most shocking killers. At first, everyone thought Velma Barfield was doing everything right. She brewed him teas, fed him broth, stayed up all night checking on him. To friends and neighbors, she looked like the perfect caregiver, devoted, selfless, even saintly. But behind that mask was a deadly secret. Stewart's mystery illness only got worse. Days of unbearable stomach pain, violent vomiting, even chest pains. By February 3rd, he was gone, declared dead at Cape Fear Valley Hospital. The doctor chalked it up to severe gastroenteritis, just another tragic case of food poisoning. But this time, the family wasn't buying it. Unlike Velma's previous victims, Stewart was young, healthy, and had just discovered Velma's forgeries in his bank account. The timing was far too suspicious. His relatives demanded a full autopsy, something Velma had managed to avoid for years, and that's when everything started to unravel. Velma's own sister, torn between protecting family and doing the right thing, made a heartbreaking call to police. Through tears, she told investigators she believed her sister had poisoned Stewart. and maybe others too. When toxicology reports confirmed lethal amounts of arsenic in Stewart's system, police finally had the smoking gun. On March 28, 1978, Velma Barfield was arrested, ending nearly a decade of undetected killings. The news shook rural North Carolina to its core. To neighbors, she was the unlucky widow, the sweet grandmother, the church-going caregiver. But to investigators, she was now one of America's most cold-blooded serial poisoners. Under questioning, Velma's facade cracked. Piece by piece, she admitted to poisoning Stewart, her own mother, Lillian Bullard, Dolly Edwards, and John Henry Lee. The way she confessed, calm, almost casual, was more chilling than tears could ever be. She described doses, timing, and symptoms with an almost clinical detachment, and yet, she claimed she never meant to kill. According to Velma, the poison was just supposed to make her victim sick, buying her time to replace money she'd stolen. Investigators didn't believe a word of it. The pattern was too precise. Theft, then sickness, then death, over and over again. Soon the case widened. Bodies were exhumed. Jennings Barfield, Velma's second husband, tested positive for arsenic. Even suspicions about her first husband's accidental house fire came flooding back. The trial was set. By November 1978, Velma Barfield's face was plastered across national headlines. America couldn't believe it. The image of a sweet-faced grandmother hiding the heart of a serial killer. What happened next would seal her fate forever. What happens when the sweet church-going grandmother in your community is sitting in court accused of being a serial killer? That was the scene in 1978 when Velma Barfield went on trial for the murder of Stewart Taylor. The case was overseen by Judge Henry A. McKinnon, a veteran of countless capital trials. On one side, prosecutor Joe Freeman Britt laid out a devastating timeline, stretching from the mysterious house fire that killed Velma's first husband in 1969, all the way to Stewart Taylor's poisoning nearly a decade later. The jury heard how money always seemed to vanish when Velma was around. They heard about forged checks, stolen accounts, and the chilling pattern of death that followed every discovery of her crimes. Witnesses recalled how she insisted on preparing food and drinks for her victims, how she hovered over their sickbeds, and how she always seemed just a little too eager to explain their symptoms to family and doctors. The defense? They had an almost impossible job. Attorneys Robert Jacobson and Richard Burr tried to argue that Velma wasn't evil, just broken. They pointed to her lifelong pill addiction, her rough childhood, and even claimed she suffered from multiple personalities. A psychiatrist testified that Velma had an alternate self named Billy, who supposedly committed the murders, but the judge wasn't convinced. His response was blunt: one of them did it. I don't care which one. The jury needed less than an hour to reach their decision: guilty of first-degree murder. Then came the sentencing phase. Would Velma spend life in prison or face execution? The prosecution argued the killing was for money, to cover up crimes, and carried out in a cruel, calculated way. The defense pushed back with stories of addiction, mental illness, and her role as a mother and grandmother. But in the end, the jury sided with the prosecution. Velma Barfield was sentenced to death, making her one of the very few women on death row in America at the time. Her appeals dragged on for 6 long years. Lawyers fought on every angle: ineffective counsel, constitutional rights, prosecutorial misconduct. But during those years, something else began to change. Velma claimed a religious conversion. On death row, she led Bible studies, counseled other women, and even drew the attention of Billy and Ruth Graham. Suddenly, thousands of people, church groups, pastors, and ordinary citizens, begged for her life to be spared. Letters poured into the governor's office asking for clemency, but the families of her victims weren't swayed. To them, her newfound faith was too little, too late. They remembered the stolen money, the agony of slow arsenic deaths, and the years of deception. Governor Jim Hunt made his choice: no clemency. Velma's crimes were too cold, too deliberate, and so on November 2nd, 1984, at 2:15 in the morning, Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection. She became the first woman executed in the United States in over 20 years, and the first woman in American history to die by injection. Her final words were quiet. She apologized to the families for the pain she had caused, and thanked those who had supported her. Strangely, her last meal, cheese doodles, and a Coca-Cola seemed almost childlike, a haunting reminder of the contradictions in her life. Velma was buried beside her first husband, the man whose death had started it all. But her story didn't end there. Velma Barfield's case forced doctors, law enforcement, and courts to change the way they viewed suspicious deaths. It revealed how easy it had been for someone to hide behind the mask of caregiver, daughter, grandmother, while secretly poisoning those who trusted her most. And here's the chilling part. Investigators always suspected there may have been more victims. Bodies cremated, graves never tested, patterns that couldn't be fully proven. To this day, we may never know the true number of lives she claimed. So I'll leave you with this question. Do you believe we've uncovered all of Velma's victims? Or could her dark legacy be even bigger than we imagine? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story as haunting as I did, make sure you like, share, and subscribe, because there are plenty more hidden horrors in history still waiting to be uncovered.